where you are geographically, because we always, as an English person, I'm always slightly amazed at how big the country is. So feel free to pop in the chat, and it also checks that the chat is working.
Yes.
For you all.
Jacksonville,
Florida, because it turns out there are multiple Jacksonvilles in the country. Things I didn't know.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, hello, Illinois.
Illinois representing.
Is it cold? Like, as in, is it snow cold for you guys?
It snowed yesterday, and there's not really snow on the ground today, but it was really pretty.
Oh, okay. So, David, you have told us where you are in the Q&A button, which is lovely. But can you, if you put it in the chat, although I have just answered that question anyway for you. Colorado. Ed is in Oxford, but also from Nottingham in the United Kingdom. So the ground of student mission history, Oxford, Wesley, the Holy Club. I mean, if you guys want to Google Oxford, England and university student mission, you will get some remarkable revival stories. And that's where Ed is currently speaking to us from today.
Amazing.
Great. Welcome those of you that are just joining us. I think we're going to try and keep the time and respect your time. We have 1 hour. This is probably lots of people's lunch breaks or something that they're half listening to whilst they're supposed to be doing work. So if any colleagues are looking at you right now, give them a small quiet wave as if you're just getting on with your work when you're actually listening into how to disciple people. But I think we'll make a start.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Yes, so we have discovered the Q&A part already, but if you're not familiar with Zoom webinar, welcome. It's a little bit different than Zoom meetings. There is a Q&A function either on the bottom or the top of your screen. And throughout the webinar, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll read them throughout and have time at the end to go through your questions. So we do welcome your questions. My name is Lauren Hansen, and I am Fusion USA's Church Engagement Manager. So excited to welcome you to our Discipling College Students webinar today. But as you're registering, you might have wondered, who is Fusion? We're a bit newer in the United States. We've existed, Fusion, as a movement for over 25 years, and it started in the United Kingdom in the late 1990s. Fusion's founder, Rich Wilson, with some of his peers, just began to plant student small groups in the United Kingdom, and they started to multiply. And before they knew it, there were over 500 in the UK. And after about 5 years, they realized that the student small groups that were the most healthy were connected to a local church. And so after prayer, they kind of shifted their model from just planning missional small groups of students to equipping the local church to reach college students in the nation. And so today they are equipping over 2,500 churches in the United Kingdom and expanding globally. And here in the United States, one of our speakers, Miriam Swanson, married an American and moved to Florida and kind of took the call to pioneer Fusion in the United States. And so we're so excited to pioneer here. The need is great. And I think what's unique about Fusion is that we have 25 years of experience in the UK to glean from as we start to equip the church in the United States. So it's a very, very exciting season. And so as we begin today's webinar, I would love to give you a framework for the generation that we are discussing today. There is so much hope for Generation Z. Barna Research has called them recently the open generation. So they're more open to spirituality maybe than other generations have been in the past. And prophetically, they've been called the generation that will burn for Jesus. They're born between 1997 and 2012. So that's 10 to 25 years old. So we're talking more specifically about college students today, but they fall into that at that range. They're the largest and most racially diverse generation in the US, with nearly 50% being non-white. They are also on track to be the most educated. They're more likely to finish high school and pursue college compared to other generations. And as you can see on this chart, they have a strong desire to finish their education and start their careers. Gen Z cares about the environment, health, and justice. They're deeply connected to social causes, and they were born into technology. They're called digital natives or the global generation. And Stanford did a study specifically on this generation, and this is kind of what they called them in kind of a summary description. A Gen Zer is a self-driver who deeply cares about others, strives for a diverse community, is highly collaborative and social, values flexibility, relevance, authenticity, and non-hierarchical leadership. And while they're dismayed about the inherited social challenges and issues like climate change, they do have a pragmatic attitude about the work that has to be done to address the issues. And so at the same time, though, they have the highest levels of anxiety and depression in our nation. Even across the world, research has shown that it's grown, anxiety and depression has grown by 25% since the pandemic and during it as well. So when it comes to discipling them, specifically within church and spirituality, there are also a few unique challenges with this generation. Because they have more options than ever, podcasts and worships and apps, it can create unrealistic expectations of their relationship with the church, being that they have this radical individuality. In addition, many of them come from or have been dubbed the most fatherless generation. They haven't experienced true family, and the stats connected to not having a father figure in the home are staggering. 60% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 90% of homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. 85% of children who show behavioral issues are from fatherless homes. And so it's really, really interesting because this is the first generation where there's not a lack of fathers due to a war, but actually it's a heart condition, a heart problem. But I do think the church has a really important role to play in that. And then lastly, just another unique challenge, like we're all facing, is a hypersexualized culture. 70% of 18 to 34-year-olds regularly view porn online. And even if they manage not to, there are repeated exposure to sexual messages and innuendo throughout our culture. So just a couple challenges in discipling this generation. In 2019, Barna released some groundbreaking research, and they, from that, found that the number one reason young adults leave the church, so for those that are actually in the church, is insufficient discipleship. And so this is a need that's very, very crucial. And so just as we begin today, I'd love to share with you 4 ways that we could create a culture of discipleship with college students. The first is creating spaces. I recently watched a webinar or listened to a podcast where the speaker was sharing the best parenting advice that he had ever received. His children were grown now, and this person told him to delight in what your children delight in what they delight in. And I think this is something that we can learn for Generation Z as well. Because they're passionate about social causes, I think there's this beautiful connection between that passion and then the church's call for biblical justice. And so we can really collaborate on social causes with the generation. One of the churches we work with in Ohio recently volunteered on the campus with the campus's Habitat for Humanity, where they built a home in their community. And a bunch of football players volunteered, and they housed all the materials at the church. So the football players ended up getting the materials from the church one Sunday, ended up staying for worship, and about half of them gave their lives to Jesus. So there's just this interesting connection as we can serve together. It's really, really interesting too, in regards to creating spaces. Stanford also looked at Gen Z in that study, their preferred method of communication, and they assumed it would be, text message or direct message, social media. But nearly every single person in this study from this generation said their favorite form of communication was in person. And so I think connecting students with church family and building those generations, giving them spiritual moms and dads and brothers and sisters and grandparents is such a powerful way to build that culture of discipleship. The second way is to celebrate stories. We have a saying at Fusion to celebrate what you want to replicate. And there's a church we work with in Florida. I believe Taylor is on our call today, our webinar today. They posted an awesome Instagram post. Their Friday college moms group served dinner for their prodigal college night ministry. So they served their college students dinner one night, which who doesn't love a home cooked meal from a mom when you're in college? And they posted just a picture on Instagram talking about that intergenerational connection, and just again celebrating what they want to replicate. So I thought that was a great example of there's these spaces, and maybe your churches are already building these connections, but just sharing those stories and in online platforms as well. The third way to create a culture of discipleship is to provide college students with a healthy level of both support and challenge. As we saw with the anxiety and depression levels, students are desperately in need of support, but they're also there's a place for challenging them in following the ways of Jesus and calling them to risk and holding them accountable and responsible. And so kind of providing this blend of support and challenge. Fusion has a really fun resource called a discipleship deck, and it's a deck of 52 cards, like playing cards. And each card has a question on it having to do with deeper discipleship around the topics of relationships and lifestyle and spirituality and mission. And it's a nice way to ask sometimes those more awkward questions. As you lay out the deck of cards or the question on the deck, it asks it for you. So that's just one of the ways too. And then the final way I would say is to actually calm fears. I talk to so many older adults, and I invite them to serve with our college students, our young adults. And they say, I hear this all the time, like, oh, I have nothing to offer. Like, I don't know how to relate. And at the same time, Gen Z is saying like, oh, I really need help, but I'm afraid to ask for help. And so I think one of the ways that we can help is to bridge those connections. I heard it called closing the triangle. And so if you have the Gen Z and the older adults, you can be the link to bridge them together. There is such power, I think, in the generations connecting to one another. In a research study by Kinnaman, Hawkins, and Matlock, they wrote a book called Faith for Exiles, and they found that for students whose faith was what they called resilient, lasted through college into adulthood, they found these 5 factors, and one of them is intergenerational relationships. And so there's so much power in the older generations passing down the knowledge and the wisdom that they have, and even just in being with the students, helping them see like marriage modeled, parenting modeled, and kind of how to live the Jesus life day to day. And then at the same time, young adults have so much to offer the next generation in creativity and passion. And so just bridging these two together is really, really can be really, really powerful. So those are just a couple ways to create that culture, to be thinking about that culture of discipleship. And now I would love to introduce you to Miriam Swanson. She was making the funny remarks at the beginning of the webinar, as she does. She's the director of Fusion USA. She has worked with Fusion Movement for 12 years and recently began pioneering here in the US. So we're so grateful to have her leadership. And her and Ed will be taking things from here.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So I do recommend, if you guys haven't read Faith for Exiles, or if you haven't accessed the new Open Generation research by Barna that's just been released, I do recommend that you check those resources out. We'll be doing a webinar in the new year with Barna, unpacking more around discipling this next generation, but that was brilliant from Lauren to give us a taste of some of that stuff. I guess before I bring my friend Ed and we have a bit of a conversation around deeper discipleship, I wanted to draw upon scripture and a passage of scripture, an account of Jesus walking and discipling relationships with some of his friends, and just the encouragement as well as really practical outworking that we can see in the accounts of Christ about actually what discipleship might mean now. And although obviously there's something timeless about applying the practices of Jesus for every generation, when I look at the story in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus, I'm struck by how incredibly pertinent this example of walking in friendship with followers towards Christ and yet with Christ, just how much there is in there that would really resonate with the hunger and longing in Gen Z, and things that all of us could offer just by being a person alive and walking without lots of special qualifications or feeling like, I've got nothing to offer. I think Jesus's posture in Luke 24 offers us some real gold about how we in fact could begin discipleship relationships with Gen Z right now. So in Luke 24, on the journey of the road to Emmaus, I'm not going to read the whole passage, but I'm going to pull out to you some moments I see chronologically through this account in the story. And I'd love you to, I suppose, feel free to go away and actually have a moment of studying the road to Emmaus account yourself and notice what are you being discipled in, even as you walk on that road. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just touch upon some things that I see on the road to Emmaus. So we meet two followers walking away from Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. Jerusalem, what had just happened there was the arrest, rigged trial, and crucifixion of Christ. And then these guys walking away from Jerusalem don't know that he's risen from the dead. So they are in a state of grief, of hopelessness, of confusion, disillusionment. They're deconstructing their faith because they're wondering whether Jesus was who he said he was. Does it make any difference to my life after all? My hope now feels disappointed. And so they're walking away from all that it meant for them to be following Jesus. And they're having a big discussion about it. And I'm not saying that every young person is in that space, but as we come out of the pandemic with a lot of the most formational years of young people happening during global crisis, do not be surprised. I'm sure you know, because the chances are the people tuning in some way care about or share life with college students and young adults. But you know that they're asking big life questions and they're struggling to see God in the midst of some of the suffering or some of the questions that they've got that don't have easy answers. And so even the posture of the two followers walking away as they talk about everything that's just happened and how difficult that was, that is similar to a lot of our young adults right now. So as Jesus joins the two on the road to Emmaus, they are already deep in conversation. And so the first thing that happens is as they're talking, Jesus just walks with them, listening. He doesn't interrupt them. He hasn't got a resource to give them. He hasn't invited them to a program, and he hasn't immediately told them what they should be talking about or questions they should be asking. Actually, Jesus just begins to keep pace as the two continue a conversation, and he doesn't even interrupt them. And so for me, that speaks of that relational element with young adults and young people as we meet them, starting by not assuming where they're at on the journey, but listening out for where they're already having conversations, questioning, asking things about faith and life. And we see in the road to Emmaus, Jesus just walks with them. And in fact, as he's walking with them, he chooses to ask them, could you open up more? Could you explain a bit more what you're talking about? Which is hilarious in the case of Jesus, because he already knows everything that they're talking about. The fact that he also says what happened in Jerusalem is what I describe as comedy Jesus, because it's about him. The thing that happened in Jerusalem was the crucifixion of Christ. So it's actually funny that God goes, oh no, I don't know what happened. Why? Did something go on in Jerusalem? It was you that went on in Jerusalem, Jesus. Anyway, so he takes a bit of humor, which is also helpful to remember if we all get a bit serious, that Jesus actually kind of found it quite funny to just make a bit of a joke, be very lighthearted and not come in with heavy answers, but ask better questions. So he says to them, what are you talking about? What's happening for you? And then these two followers process pain, grief, disappointment. They literally use this phrase, we had hoped that he was the Messiah. We had hoped that he would have saved Israel. And Jesus gives them that space to say, I've had hope disappointed. If you have spoken to a teenager or a young adult in the last few months, if you've created a safe enough space for them to actually feel listened to, there is no doubt in my mind that you will come across some element of disappointment, confusion, sense of loss, or sense of uncertainty about the future. We had hoped. Part of our discipling relationships is actually giving the space and permission for somebody to say, I am not okay, or I am struggling with where to see God, or I've actually got some big questions about faith and life, and I don't feel certain. Jesus was not intimidated by those conversations. He, in fact, made extra space for them. And after Jesus has listened to his followers, there is a time that he decides to speak back. So the things that they've processed, he then speaks truth. And the way he does it is that he takes them through their own story. So Jesus opens up the Hebrew scriptures and says, you've actually missed something around what God already told you he was going to do. And then he takes them back through Moses and the prophets and basically says, look at what God said. Like he always said the Messiah would come. He always said the Messiah would suffer. And he always said the Messiah would overcome. And so Jesus takes them back through their own story and then says, this is where I see God at work. Now, some of us might indeed find that one of the ways that this generation that we do engage with them is by indeed opening scripture. And I'd say I often forget how powerful the actual words of the actual Bible can be to a life, because it's more than a book, isn't it? It's God breathed, and sometimes words of scripture alone change your life, change your heart. But there's another challenge in there around Jesus telling them the story they already knew, but reframing it in the eyes of faith and saying, actually, this is where I think God hasn't been missing from your story. And when we're discipling people, just double listening to both their story and to what the Holy Spirit has been doing, is doing, and will do, is another key element to relationally walking with people. So as Jesus listens to their disappointment, he's able to say, you know, in the stories that you believe, that you've been memorized since you were a child, do you remember in those stories how God said you would be exiled, but then I bring you back? That he would send a savior, that from the house of David, one would come. Like Jesus can speak to them about their own history and say, this is where God is. And I do wonder for some of us, if as we listen to young people, we might actually be able to spot, I'm not sure that sounded like a coincidence. Was that a person of faith that asked you that question? Have you ever prayed? Because that kind of sounds like, do you see what I mean? You can start to see God at work, because it turns out in a lot of discipleship and evangelism moments, God is already at work, and then we stumble into what he's already doing and join in. Next slide. Jesus, then, he's spoken for a bit, but then he does this other thing that's, again, comedy Jesus, and he pretends to leave. He doesn't overstay his welcome. He doesn't force the conversation further. He actually gives his followers the chance to invite him closer, to ask more, or to leave it there. And when it comes to our young people who are just working out who they are in their adult life, who are just working out whether they can trust the adults around them, who are just trying to find their feet in faith for the first time, or maybe the first time outside of their household where they're growing up in faith and they're making decisions for themselves, giving them the freedom and the space to choose to come towards faith, to choose to come towards deeper discipleship, rather than sort of putting upon them a program, an agenda, and then a next steps. It's actually really important to just leave enough breathing room for a young person to mature towards choosing to go further. And so Jesus, for these guys, talks to them and then goes, oh, it's getting late, I better go. And he pretends to go further on. And then they say, hey, it's nearly evening, do you want to have dinner with us? Like, it's dinner time. Can we carry on the conversation over dinner? So where do we create spaces where young people can also initiate or go further with us? It's not all on us initiating with them. And that is part of a mature mentoring or discipleship relationship, is giving some power to that 19-year-old to say, it will always be a yes for me to find a time to meet up with you and prioritize connecting with you. But I want you to also learn to initiate and also learn to ask for those moments, because that is actually growing a young person into taking responsibility for their discipleship too. It's a two-way street. We then see Jesus eat with his disciples, breaks bread, shares the family table, shares a meal with them. It's in fact, as he breaks bread and prays, that that's when the followers realize, actually, God is here. God is amongst us. This is not just a stranger. This is friend. And not only does that remind them of the Last Supper and the resonances where Jesus had just said, do this in remembrance of me 3 days earlier, But I think there's something around sharing the table and prayer that helps people recognize the Spirit of God is actually here. The presence of God is here. So even when we think about discipleship models and trading coffee shops for dinner tables, trading sitting in a stagnant place to going on a walk, where can we learn about some of this dynamic from the road to Emmaus? Jesus then does something else that's comedy Jesus, and he disappears in what can only be described as Frodo putting the ring on in Lord of the Rings, or something similar. He literally just goes, bing, gone, which to me is comedy, but resurrected Jesus can literally do this kind of thing. What he does, though, is he leaves them hungry for more. So it's not a one and done conversation. He leaves them going, didn't our hearts burn within us as he opened up the scriptures to us on the road? I think I recognized him when he broke the bread. They begin to see more of God, and it makes them hungry to continue to pursue him. And the final thing we see in the Road to Emmaus story is that the followers dash back to Jerusalem. They head back towards the place that they had left in disappointment, and now they return in faith, seeking more. They return to community. They return to other disciples to say, he's risen. We've seen him. Disciples make disciples. When you are on a journey being apprenticed to Jesus and you encounter him on the road, this is when evangelism happens, because you can't help but share the one that you're walking with, because your heart is burning within you, because he's opened the scriptures to us, because we've encountered the presence of God. And so recognizing deeper discipleship with this generation will always go beyond you and that one person. They in turn will make disciples, because to be a disciple means that you are discipling others and making disciples on the road as you go. And so just know that you might have one or two that are on your list for walking alongside in your church or community. Those one or two actually represent 10s and 20s of other young people that are in their community that will have a different discipleship story because you discipled the people in front of you. So Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus has been a really helpful reflection when we think theologically about discipleship and setting that culture. Now, moving on from that culture of discipleship, I actually want to bring Ed into this conversation. Ed Earnshaw works for Fusion back in the United Kingdom. For a number of years, he's been equipping churches to reach university students all over England. And Ed is also one of the team that have really pioneered and got stuck into having good discipleship conversations and really helping equip the church in the stuff that we're talking about. So Ed, first of all, give us a bit of a taste of who you are and where are you from, that sort of stuff.
Who am I? I'm another English accent for the call, so it's great to be with you. Thank you. I'm honoured to be here. Yes, so I am based in Nottingham. I'm actually speaking to you from Oxford in the UK today. But yeah, a little bit about me. So I was raised in a Christian home, but for me, university, college was where my faith came alive. I often say that's where I became comfortable in my own skin as a Christian, and where I realised, oh, God is doing something in and can do something through me. And actually, like, people do come to faith, and they don't just fall away from faith. And for me, university was a really transformative time. And off the back of that, I spent 5 years as kind of college student pastor at the Vineyard Church I'm a part of in Nottingham. So I spent 5 years working really closely with students, building formational friendships with them. And alongside that, I've also worked for Fusion in the UK as a student mission developer. So this involves traveling around the UK, chatting with different churches, helping them think through how can you reach and disciple college, university students in your context? What does it look like for you to build really formational friendships with them, where they can see the reality of who Jesus is radically impact their life and the lives of their course mates, the people they study with, they live with, they play sport with. So yeah, that's a bit of who I am. I've been doing that for like over 5 years now, which has been amazing.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. And so you've got a lot of experience both locally and around the nation in the UK. And one of the reasons why we wanted to bring in a UK practitioner voice is because, as many of you will know, Europe is much further along the road when it comes to losing cultural Christianity, becoming a post-Christian culture. And in fact, recently, one of my friends said the way that they're now describing Europe is pre-revival, because it's so far gone from being a Christian place, it must be about to experience spiritual awakening in Jesus' name. And so Ed is working in a context where on average, in any university town or city, when you look at a student population, you can't really account for more than about 1 to 2% of that university population engaged regularly in the local church who are kind of card-carrying followers of Jesus that are part of his family. And so Ed is working with tiny numbers when it comes to current Christians, and therefore the need to have disciples who make disciples and reach and have formational friendships is so pressing, because there isn't this default, oh, there's just hundreds of young adults that just are here and they follow Jesus and they come. They don't. Ed is constantly mobilizing the church to go and create those friendships almost from scratch. And so the reason I wanted to bring on that voice as well is because America and our stats are heading in that direction. Cultural Christianity is really dying out in younger generations very quickly. And in certain pockets of the USA, they would already be very similar to our Londons and our Manchesters and some of the cities that Ed works in the United Kingdom. And so I think it's wise to learn from places that may be about 10 years, if not maybe less, ahead of some of the slide away from cultural Christianity, and then the re-emergence of a few vibrant Christians and young people stepping back up and working what it means to follow faith, even as a minority. And so, Ed, tell us some of the challenges, the greatest challenges in your context, and some of the greatest opportunities you see when it comes to discipleship and this generation.
Yeah, I think both you just touched on it then, and Lauren touched on it earlier. I think I think this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity and a challenge, but I tend to see it as more of an opportunity. But yeah, cultural Christianity is less of a thing in the United Kingdom now. I guess we have like a state church, the Church of England, but beyond that, people's experience of church is very limited, if any. Like, they may occasionally have gone to church for Christmas or an occasion like that. So actually there isn't much experience of church, but what that produces, I think, is a real openness to church. There's a real willingness to try church, which is really encouraging. And I'm always taken aback by how open students are to trying church. We're currently surveying students in the United Kingdom around their attitudes to identity and well-being, and we currently reckon like a large proportion, maybe like over 70% of non-Christian students, of those we surveyed so far, are open to trying church if a friend invited them, which is really encouraging and really transformative. And I'm always heartened by that. And I think as well, there's a big part of Generation Z, they're just really curious and inquisitive. They want to know more, they want to learn. And I think that desire to respect and kind of like tolerate other people's beliefs, that actually comes into it a bit, where they're like, oh, I want to go because I want to support what maybe my friends are doing. I want to experience something I've never caught quite of. And I think, and again, Lauren, yes, sorry, Z. And Lauren touched on it as well, but I think there are various parts, like knot points almost, where the gospel message resonates with what this generation of college students are really passionate about, like justice, for instance, the biblical call to justice. This is a justice-minded generation, so there's something that speaks into that. I'm really conscious of how lots of students are really aware of their own well-being, like their mental health and stuff. And actually, there's something about the Bible, like ancient practices, that really speaks into that. And like, actually, it's almost like people rediscovering these through the church. And I think there's a real space for that for how we form friendships, where we can speak into that situation for those who are studying at university. And I think people are really hungry for community as well. I think that's something, if we've been raised and always been in a church context, we take it for granted. But actually, lots of people don't have an established community. Like, for them, a community, college would look like maybe the people they study with or play sports with. But beyond that, especially an intergenerational community where there's people who are older than them and younger than them, that's really rare. And people are hungry for that. They're hungry for belonging, a place where they can feel needed and known. So I think that's what the church is naturally set up for. So I think those all produce really rich opportunities for forming friendships and formational relationships with people. But yeah, of course, there are challenges with that as well. One challenge, I think, is consistency and commitment. I think actually people can get excited, but there's always sometimes a struggle with follow through and what that looks like. And so I think actually we really need to fight for people. We need to be persistent with them. We need to persevere in forming a relationship with them. And because actually sometimes we may have a couple of good connections, but they then may fade away. And so I think I've noticed when chatting with lots of like people who work with college students, there's a real desire to figure out, what does it look like to build relationships that last? How can we cultivate a desire for people to really get stuck in with what's going on and to invest in the relationships they have. I think as well, there's I do think there's a confidence issue. I think students aren't they're not unconfident, but I think they fail to, or they don't always seem to really appreciate just what God can do in and through them, like what they're capable of. And I think sometimes they discount themselves. So I think there's a lot of things where actually when we're building relationship with this generation, we need to equip them and give them vision for how God can work in and through them and in the lives of their friends. Because I've definitely seen where that can be a barrier as well. And I guess as well, sometimes there is, sometimes an authority issue, perhaps. I guess I think this generation has a bit of a complicated relationship with authority. I think that's often because we see people in positions of authority in the church and out where maybe that's been broken, where that things have felt a bit complicated. And so actually, I think people we all do this, but you can see this particularly with the current college student generation, that actually the most trustworthy source of authority in their lives is themselves. And as a result of that, I think that they that directs how they will approach things. But obviously, when we look at the Bible, we're trusting that God is the source of authority in our life. And so I think helping students recognize that and think actually God's plans for our lives are better than our own plans. God's purposes for our lives are better than our own purposes. What he wants for us is actually better than anything we could want for ourselves. I think learning how to navigate that is without alienating students, college students, is particularly important. And I think the final thing is just there's so many different places where students can misplace their value and find their identity, like it's how well I do in my course, like the qualification I get, the career I achieve after I graduate, the friendship circle, the romantic relationship I'm in. And we know as followers of Jesus, our identity before any of those things is anchored in being a son or daughter of God. And so I think actually the power of those other places where college students can misplace their value is really powerful. So I think it's working out how does the power of being a follower of Jesus, that identity that we carry, a co-heir of Christ, how does that really cut through? They're a bit of a mixture, I would say.
It's really good. That's a lot of big good thoughts there. I hope you all are taking notes.
Sorry.
No, it's good. It's really good. I suppose in some ways the next question I want to ask therefore is, okay, you've convinced me of the need and you've convinced me of the opportunity, and even how challenges present an opportunity. How do we actually do this? So partly I'm thinking lots of churches default to maybe programs or front-led events or bigger gatherings because it is easier to organize, gathering everyone in a room and setting content from the front. That's much easier than basically trying to help broker lots of organic discipling relationships. So, and yet we're saying we've got to break down the front-led, the gathered where it's almost too big a group to actually say how you're really doing or have a conversation. What good models have you seen, or how do we practically form some of these friendships and have these disciple-making moments that aren't, how do you do that when I feel like that's a bit trickier to actually create?
Yeah, I think don't get me wrong, I think there's definitely a place for events and big front-led stuff. I think they're powerful and there's definitely a place for them. But in my experience, the most fruitful connections, the most encouraging stories come from the smaller, the one-to-one relationships in the small groups. So I think a lot of it is about how do we, as you say, use the organized to lead to something that's organic. Like how can that be a catalyst for the organic? And so whether that's in creating like a small group model within church relations, like how can we encourage students with maybe a couple of like trusted younger adults who are a bit further down the line? How can they host those spaces, and how can college students be equipped to host those spaces themselves? And what do one-to-one relationships look like, not just between college students themselves, but with older mentors, or for those of us who are kind of the ministry practitioners? I think figuring out how we cultivate those things are really good, because actually we can host an event and have lots of people in front of us and people can seem to really engage, but we then won't necessarily understand what's happening beneath the surface. We don't create the time to figure out what's going on in their life, what's exciting them, what's causing them anxiety. you know, what is the stumbling block for them in their university time. And I think within those relationships, there are things that are really key. For me, one of them is just modeling vulnerability. I think it's so easy to present filtered versions of ourselves, right? Like we feel like we have to give the best account of ourselves. And I'm certainly guilty of doing that a lot. And, you know, and actually that can be really difficult for us as leaders, because sometimes we don't want to show our weakness because it's like, oh no, but I think when we do that, as Lauren mentioned, this generation, they really value authenticity. And when we can authentically model where we get things wrong and we don't always do things right, I think that really speaks true. And I think it also allows them to trust. It forms trust. I think that's such a key thing for college students, knowing that they can trust someone and be like, actually, I can be really open with you and what I'm doing, and I'm not going to face judgment. You know, even if I'm really struggling with something, I'm still going to be loved, known, and welcomed in this. So I think that is really key. I also think question asking is super powerful, and I've learned this more and more, especially being a part of Fusion. We really put so much value on answers, don't we? We feel like we need to have a correct answer for everything, and almost sometimes we feel like we need to argue people into the kingdom or give them like the right philosophy. And the Bible speaks into that. We're called to have like a good response to questions. So don't get me wrong, we need to think things through. But I think questions are often way more powerful, aren't they? They're often how we learn more. They're often how we relate better with others, and they're often how we challenged more effectively as well. I think when we're asked a question, it allows us to kind of consider and reflect. And I don't think we ask good questions enough. I think often the questions we ask in conversations, particularly with college students, they're quite surface level. I know for a lot of, in the UK, a lot of university students, the questions they'll be asked most when they start university is, where do you come from? What do you study and what's your name? And it won't go much deeper than that, as if their identity is based on those things. They're not asked questions that really unlocks who they are. They kind of challenges their worldview or encourages them to look at things in a different way. And I think Jesus really models this. You mentioned about Emmaus Road, but that's a great example of them asking questions, and parallel to the Good Samaritan. And I think there's a book called Jesus the Question where
you're gonna love me for this.
There we go. Yeah, like literally it says he answers 3 and asks over 307 questions.
Martin Copenhaver, Jesus is the Question. There's a little book recommendation for you to unpack this idea further.
Great book. And I think that's interesting, isn't it? Jesus, like, he could give them the answers, but he chooses not to. He disciples people by asking questions. And one thing I find that really releasing, because I'm like, oh, thank goodness I don't necessarily need to have all the answers for everything, because I certainly don't. On the other hand, it actually puts the ball back in their court and gets students to think through, okay, what do I think about this? What is God saying to me in this situation? And so I think we need to learn to ask better questions, really. I think that's a key thing. And the next one, I guess, is just giving your time. I'm always amazed I think we need to give lots of time, but even just a little bit of time, I think, goes a long way. I was chatting to a friend who leads a college student ministry, and they were like, she only had time to invite someone over to dinner for 1 hour, but that was the thing that let them commit to that church, and they started coming pretty much every Sunday afterwards. And she was surprised that's what it did, and that sense of like, I've seen you, I value you, I've given you time. So yeah, that's really important. And yeah, I think if you're busy and stuff, it's just figuring out, where do people fit in, like, where in my day-to-day rhythm can this fit in?
Really good, really good. And so I do really quickly want to mention the Fusion decks of cards that Laura mentioned earlier. Ed, can you just explain what they are? Because we basically really did take this culture of asking better questions and creating space and made a resource that could help anybody have more formational conversations in discipleship. Do you want to explain what they are? And Lauren will get a slide up to show you what we're talking about.
Yeah, so as Lauren mentioned, these are decks of cards. So the discipleship deck is a deck of 52 playing cards, and you can use them as such, but on each card is a question relating to spiritual growth, lifestyle, mission, relationships. And the aim is you can play games with them and stuff, or just get people to randomly select them. And there are loads of really great questions on there designed to stimulate conversation that goes below the surface, that gets people to open up and be honest and really engage with faith. So questions like, how is your generosity costing you? Like, what does your social media consumption look like at the moment? How is your relationship with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? who you praying will come to faith in Jesus. And they're just things to catalyze discipleship. And I've used them in so many contexts, and it's really helpful. It takes the onus off of me from asking the questions and does it in a really accessible way. And it makes it fun as well. Led a small group session once with 13 strangers. And after just one session, there was such an incredible level of closeness and intimacy because of using this deck of cards and like the openness and the connection it brought about, and just realizing, oh, this is a safe space where we can really explore life's challenges together. And the DMC deck, we realized actually our friends who don't know Jesus, the college students' mates, they need to have these conversations as well. So whereas the discipleship deck will assume you're a Christian, the DMC deck, Deep Meaningful Conversation, is aimed at anyone can answer those questions. So questions such as, if you can invite any 3 people in the world over for dinner, who would you invite? What are you scared of? You know, who are you good for and who's good for you? And all of that stuff. And we've had amazing stories in the UK of college students using these with their non-Christian friends, and off the back of it, people getting stuck into really hours-long conversation that leads people to coming along to church on a regular basis. So it's been really encouraging.
So good. So we've got a discount code for you guys on this call today to get these decks of cards. Honestly, this is the resource that's like sold out the most that Fusion have ever created, and we sort of did it. We know it's a bit gimmicky to make a pack of cards, but we basically could see this is quite a useful idea for discipleship conversations. We just had no idea how useful it would be to youth workers, college student workers, young adult pastors, and parents. And I've got a friend who does kind of social work type stuff with young people coming out of homelessness and addiction and incarceration. And she would say the DMC deck of cards is like a God-given way to create sacred spaces and deep conversations with people that she wouldn't otherwise know how to build a bridge with. So I know that feels like a shameless plug, but it's honestly because this stuff is genuinely helpful. And they're also just a fun deck of playing cards, because who doesn't want discipleship and poker in their lives?
Yeah, fun. They're really great.
That's great. That's great. We've got a couple minutes. If you guys do have any questions that you can put in the Q&A function for Lauren, as she's talked about Gen Z, for Ed, as he's unpacked a bit more of that practical, looking at discipling this generation. If any questions are bubbling up, now is a really good time to put them in the Q&A, because we've got about 10 minutes to do that. Whilst you guys think of your burning question to ask Ed or Lauren, Ed, perhaps you could share us a story of encouragement and hope that could inspire us. Whilst people are writing any questions.
For sure. So we here in Oxford have a colleague, and they say God downloaded this idea into them. And basically they had this idea to set up a banquet table on campus at Oxford University, just out in the open in front of everyone. And the idea was that this is God's table. It's like representative of what it means to have a seat at God's table. So they made it look really nice, loads of great food and drink and stuff. And just as students wandered past, college students, they invited them to like sit down, to have conversation. And I think they engaged with like over 100 students doing this. I think one of them, they ended up having like a conversation up, I think it was like 45 minutes chatting about faith, like background and stuff. And I think loads of amazing connections were formed off the back of that. And I've been really struck by like, actually, well, sometimes we think something like that could be quite outlandish and really outside of our comfort zone, but how God would use such a beautiful image of what his kingdom is like as a way of evangelizing to students and creating a space for those formational friendships to begin, to ask questions, to have conversations with people, to know that actually they're loved, they're seen and valued, whoever they are, you know, however they see themselves, which has been amazing. And another story, there's a town called Hull in the United Kingdom, in the northeast of the country, and there's a church there that didn't have any university students, felt really convicted about starting to reach them. So they started like a coffee morning and chat, inviting students to come in and just connect. And I think they had about 95 students engage. So from having connection with 0 students to 95 students, just by opening their doors and willing to host space, creating space for relationship, has given them now like a bit of a student community.
Really good. And so, and I'm hearing there as well, if you're not sure how to start with something that might disrupt everybody's normal, even if it's an act of generosity, hospitality, or a prophetic image. disrupt the normal and you might create discipleship moments. Taylor's asked a great question that is Europe focused. If people are saying that Europe is in the pre-revival phase, amen, please Jesus, what do you feel like revival is going to look like in that region? Ed, if a move of God happens, if an awakening of people's hearts and minds to the good news of Jesus happens, and a supernatural and extraordinary amount of people come to Christ, which is kind of how we would define that kind of thing, what do you think that actually looks like on the ground?
Yes, it's a great question. It's also kind of tricky to say because God like moves in lots of different ways. I think how I would see it is there would just be waves of people going to church. Like that'd be a normal thing for people to do. Like people be hungry for that and actually settling into church community. I think we'd see powerful works of the Spirit as well. Like actually it'd be normal for students to hear, like college students to hear of like miracles or like these strange things happening on campus. Like they wouldn't be isolated things or experiences. I think in Europe, unless you were a part of a Christian context already, it would be very rare for you to have heard of something like that ever happening. So I think like that would probably become more normalized. And I think actually they would feel like, it's quite actually a regular thing to go to church because there's something powerful happening there. And actually they a recognition that this is good for one's personal self, because actually that's going to be the thing that not only improves their well-being, but actually anchors their identity.
Nice. And I would add to that where we've seen early smolderings of what feel like a bit of a move of the Holy Spirit, increased unity across churches, denominations and leaders. Unity is a real sign of the Spirit at work because the Holy Spirit loves it when we are one. It's Jesus's great unanswered prayer still, isn't it? That we would be one as he is one. And so where we've seen people begin to pray together for the sake of the city or the campus across churches, denominations and leadership teams, that for me is a hallmark of like, well, then God's doing something. And I would also say, particularly when we think about Gen Z, when you start to see the blessing of the university and the city, not just the church, I think revival is when the church wakes up. Awakening is when you see God actually, the kingdom of God is at hand. Like you see the way of the kingdom begin to happen beyond church walls. But the university becomes a safer place. Crime goes down. Nightclub fights decrease. Sexual abuse on campus completely changes because something is changing in the people and in the Spirit. So that is my expectation, where the Spirit of God moves, there is unity, there is breakthrough, and it becomes a place of peace and blessing that tastes a bit more like the kingdom. And that's certainly some of the need that we see, and where student revivals have happened before. You guys will know this because it's, the gift of the campus. When a move of God happens, there's usually an explosion into global missions, and usually other nations are reached. And given now that the campus is also the home of nations, any move of God that happens with this generation will ripple out into every area of society and every nation on the earth because of the nature of what the university represents and who's there.
That's a great point about students who've come from abroad to study in our context, because I think that what God could do in their life when they've moved to the US or the UK could like have a transformative effect in another nation. And right. I think as well, it's so easy, isn't it, in ministry to be quite territorial, like this is our group, but actually thinking of ourselves that we're not just doing ministry for those college students who come to us, but for every student in the city to reach the lost.
It's really good. Lauren, I've got a question for you around intergenerational relationships, because I would say that it's one thing to say that we believe in it and need it. It's another thing to actually work out how to do it. And quite often my experience would be that older generations, because they don't think they've got anything to offer or aren't invited, they don't know how to walk across the room and begin a conversation with a young adult. Do you have any tips or experience that you could share around creating intergenerational relationships in the church?
Yeah, that's great. I was also thinking about the revival component. I feel like the intergenerational piece is going to play into the revival as well because of the unity even within the denomination or the generations.
Sure.
So that's really interesting. My advice, would definitely be like, be a connector. So I sometimes will like see a senior leader and see a student and I will introduce them. And that's just like a way to be a third person and kind of like bridge through any like of the awkwardness of I have nothing to offer you. I'll learn about the student and I'll learn about what the senior leader has, and any commonalities, I'll point those out right away. Those are just like ways to kind of facilitate organic relationships. And then I think, I mean, honestly, with the fatherless component, we just had a young adult dinner at a house last weekend, and I brought some kind of spiritual dads, invited them, and actually had them give like a father's blessing over the individual young adults. And it was amazing to see like 22-year-old men crying because they'd never received a blessing, just a blessing of like, oh, this is what I see in you. God, like this is like just a father's blessing over them and their future. And yeah. So there's just, those are just a couple of the ways.
Great. And just hearing that you gave the older generation a brief, which is also really helpful. If they I don't know what to say, you told them, could you give a father's blessing? Like that's just really helpful, practical advice, actually.
Yeah, and if I can jump on that, it goes back to that eating together, like around the table.
Yes.
I think it's remarkable that that's still one of the most powerful ways we can build community that they've done for thousands of years, or humanity's done for thousands of years. And actually, the power of inviting someone into your home. Most college students probably won't step foot into a person's home at the campus they've moved to. Like that's actually an incredibly powerful thing that confers value on them, to be invited into someone's home. Again, I think that builds trust in a really powerful way.
And on that, I would just note for the US context, depending culturally. So I would say when I've learned about multicultural churches and churches that are maybe more Black majority, recognizing that there's more cultural to naturally hang out in families' homes when you grow up and be around the table in a way that white culture often struggles to do, the sharing home and meals and week to week in and out of each other's lives thing. And so what I've learned from some of my friends reaching historically Black universities or leading in Black majority churches, their issue isn't sharing the table and sharing food, because they do it all the time. So in that context, they're like, that's not the issue. The issue is how to actually begin deep discipleship conversations, because we're always sharing food and we're always sharing the table, and we're always in each other's homes growing up. And so recognizing, know your culture and know the people who know how to love your neighbor, essentially. So for some people, being around the table is radical. For others, it's the deep conversation bit, but they might not be safe coming into somebody else's home in a certain neighborhood. So recognizing you might need to create safe spaces in a neutral building, like if you have a church building or a coffee shop that are up for opening a couple extra hours, and that be a safer space to create deep conversations. So just know your people, because I've definitely learned it can't be one size fits all even on that. But it's incredibly important to find out what it is that might create those spaces.
Miriam and Ed, you both carry this. A question just came in. One piece of advice for campus ministries and churches to build unity together. And we'll probably make that our last question of the day.
I would say it's really powerful to get like a kind of prayer meeting going or something like that, just at least a semi-regular point of connection between, where actually the purpose of it is to pray over the campus, pray over the college students who are there, to kind of share ideas, be creative together. Maybe the people who are hosting alternates, or you find a place on campus if possible to do that. Maybe even like walking around the campus together, praying for it, something that's quite active and like almost a mission posture. I think that works really well. And I think that prayer, I should say, has an impact, really unifying effect, I think, when we're all praying for the same thing. And that's when we're starting to look more outward and upward rather than inward. So
yeah, I agree. And I would say we've seen tools for unity have always ended up around serving and then around service-based mission. So where lots of people might not quite know how to agree theologically, or in their practice, it looks so very different when it comes to serving those most in need or acts of service to the campus or for the sake of students. Most people can't disagree with that. And so another tool for unity that we'll actually talk about in a webinar in January, I've really seen the Alpha course as a real tool for unity across cities. Churches have partnered together to run this missional opportunity where people gather around tables, eat together, and ask questions of the Christian faith. It's basically all the values we talked about today in a course that anyone can run and is local church based. And I've seen churches across denominations, including the renewed charismatic Catholic movement, really take hold of Alpha and be able to run with it across denominations in ways that you wouldn't expect unity to be so easy. So mission and service have definitely been tools for unity that I've seen, and it's certainly an ongoing prayer that campus would not be territory, but it'd be ground to bless and to share. Great.
Wonderful. I know it's top of the hour wherever you're tuning in from. So we do want to honor your time. Fusion just released US versions of Fusion Movement's top 5 best-selling resources. And so we're really excited to have them. Church and Students is kind of an apologetic of why the church has this crucial need to reach the college generation, student generation. We talked about our decks. Those are great stocking stuffers too. Small Groups Big Mission is a training manual, a workbook. It's really active of how to create small groups that are on mission, that are on fire. And then Prep for College is prepping those seniors in high school for who they want to be while they're in college, how determining their identity and the faith journey and plugging into a church, thinking about those things even before they leave. So we do have a discount. Thanks for being a part of our webinar. If you type in Fusion webinar on Fusion USA/resources, there's 10% off of all of those for the coming 2 weeks. And then in January, Miriam, would you like to share about our next webinar?
Yeah, in January, Michelle Tepper, who works for Alpha USA, will be joining me as we really unpack practically how to use this tool of Alpha that has seen literally millions of people hear the good news of Jesus and find community. We're going to be talking particularly how to apply that tool to small groups of college students. And it is something that any college student could actually run in their home, on the campus, or in the church building. And so we're going to get under the skin quite practically around making small missional community using the tool of Alpha.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Super informative. Hopefully this got your wheels turning, and we're just so excited for how churches are meeting this next generation. So thank you for your time. We wish you a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll hopefully see you in January.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.